if we do not include the customer in the future, we end up with a number of consequences. First of all, you'll have angry customers. You'll have an angry general public. Secondly, we know for a fact now from research that we will have less success in controlling the pressure on the network that results from the future of increased intermittent energy and so on. We can do a lot without the customer's involvement, but we actually can't do what we need without the customer's involvement. For the last 16 years I've been travelling around the world trying to understand how customers behave, what drives them, how they work and live, and what works on those customers in competitive markets, in competitive situations. And from that time we try to learn a lot about how to collaborate with customers to get the best out of those people. But what I'm focusing on here is two pieces of research. One is a project called Empower Demand, and we did phase 1, which is this report I just mentioned here, that you can download. And this particular pilot included 100 pilots worldwide that we analysed, around about 450,000 customers that related to, and we focused on energy efficiency, but very heavily on dynamic pricing and demand response. And so in terms of dynamic pricing, what we looked at here was, for example, time of use and critical peak pricing, real-time pricing, critical peak rebate, and all the various forms of dynamic pricing within that. Now the thing is that, but how effective is dynamic pricing, first of all? You know, why are we actually doing dynamic pricing? Well, first of all, we see here that as an average, if we take an average of those 100 pilots that we see that the average savings around at peak time, the average savings at peak time, this works, are approximately 16%. That's an average. Of course, there are some much worse cases, but there are also some much better cases than that. In terms of if you add automation to that, you double it. So I'm in no way criticizing the need for automation, quite the contrary. But the automation builds on what you already have if you have the manual control over that. So we also looked at critical peak rebate, as I said, time of use, and real-time pricing. You see that then critical peak pricing is the most effective, and it is the most effective if you then add, it's doubled if you add automation into that. So we can see that smart pricing is very valuable, it is very important, it is very effective if done well. But the question that we had in this research, but also in the new research that we've carried on from that, is, well, why is it then that some projects and pilots and programs are so ineffective and unsuccessful, and while others are extremely effective and extremely successful? Well, there are many technicalities, and if you look at the report, you will see all the various variables in there, including the sort of different price differentiation that we need and different price levels within peak control and so on. But actually what we found to be very, very important, critical really within the success, was education and communication strategy, the way that you dealt with customers, the way that you educated customers. In other words, it's not just what you do, but the way that you do it. Interestingly, what we found is not only that customers, as we say here, reduction at peak hours is 40% higher when participants are provided with feedback. Reductions at peak hours are 50% higher, and CPR reductions are 23% higher when participants were educated. In other words, what we're saying is that even at critical peak times, you achieve a lot more if you have feedback and education. People who engage in automation to control peak consumption, actually, if they don't have a good level of education and a good level of feedback that leads up to that behavior, then they actually use less energy at off-peak times than if they had never had any of that automation. In other words, automation without feedback and without education leads to a less energy-efficient customer, not a more energy-efficient customer. And of course, that customer will use less at critical peak times or peak times, but overall, they will very often use more energy than than they otherwise would have done. What we simplify the customer down to is 4 key drivers that matter to that customer. One of them is lifestyle, another one is fairness, social appropriateness, and predictability. Now, in terms of predictability, of course, you would assume that why would if the customer values predictability so much, why would they actually want to have dynamic pricing at all? And it's a good question, but it's interesting to notice that, in fact, dynamic pricing can be seen for many customers as preferable, a preferable way of creating predictability, because it's more transparent, because they have more control, because they are more enabled as a customer. And actually we're even seeing it, even if we go beyond the area of dynamic pricing, we actually see it already in Sweden and Norway, for example, where now most customers in Norway that switch energy company now choose a price or a tariff which is based on the market price. So it's a variable price, it can change. If you don't have a smart meter, it will only change every month, but it's a variable price. And it means that your price that you pay is related to the Nord Pool spot market. And that actually, plus a commission. But actually people have decided that they prefer to have more volatile tariffs than less volatile tariffs. In Sweden, where most customers used to decide to have fixed-term tariffs, they are now going in the opposite direction and deciding to have much more volatile tariffs. I'm starting to see cases where customers actually, in the name of predictability, prefer to have volatility, which sounds confusing, but it makes some sense if you think about it. Nevertheless, as prices in markets and wholesale markets increase, as they are doing all around the world, this is actually just from Australia, these graphs here, you see how much the prices have been increasing. And actually this is for electricity and this is for gas. Rapidly increasing prices, of course, lead to disquiet amongst the customer base. It means they are searching for predictability, but they don't necessarily need to search for predictability through fixed-term tariffs. But prices still rise, whatever happens in competition, prices still ultimately rise because, of course, competition only has a limited impact on prices. And customers generally, as we say, feel abused, as they do very often in this industry, full stop. Your average customer tends to feel abused by the industry, not because of necessarily what you're doing to them right now, but because of what they've experienced over a long period of time. They feel that they are not in control, that you are in control, that we are, the industry is in control. And they feel that everything is done to them, the decisions are made without their consent, and they have no ability to do anything about it. And that's why you see that customers maybe would therefore want to switch and to become enabled. But as we've seen, switching only enables them to save a certain amount of money, a relatively limited amount of money. Certainly less money typically than they could save by getting involved in energy efficiency or dynamic pricing or smart home or one of those other options that they have. So therefore switching is not the solution. Fixed tariffs are not the solution because we know that ultimately they end up paying more. They then see that smart meters are very often portrayed as just making the whole situation worse, for the obvious reason that it costs a lot of money and therefore smart meters must be responsible for that. And we've seen in many countries, such as Australia, in Victoria, where customers have, because of this, retaliated by not wanting any kind of dynamic tariffs in the market. Dynamic tariffs started to be rolled out in Victoria a couple of years ago and had to be stopped because of the public backlash, because customers were not happy with the way it was rolled out. In fact, what we found out is that it's not because they necessarily dislike dynamic tariffs or the principle of it, it's because of the roughshod way in which it was rolled out, really without their understanding, without their approval, without their ability to really take advantage of that. And it fell into everything that the customer feels negatively towards the company about. It's the company doing something to them in the company's own, apparently in the company's own interest, without the customer really having a say in that. Customers are searching for predictability, and even though this is the case of Sweden, where the prices have gone up rapidly over the years, on average, spikes but rapidly, still customers are choosing less predictable tariffs than they used to. So this leads into then the second phase of research that we did, which is called Empower Demand Phase 2, looking at customer engagement. So how do we actually get this customer engagement into dynamic prices and or smart energy prices? Well, we looked at here, we took out of all the parts that we studied previously, and as I said, we've looked at a couple of hundred, but we analysed 100 in detail, and then qualitatively looking at 7 in a lot of detail. We focused on the communication element of that, and also looking at the latest technologies, and considering how much we can improve the success of all of these measures if we only understood communication better, and if we only understood the customer a little bit better, and also applied the latest technologies. Because I should say, of course, that most of the trials that have happened, be it in energy efficiency or in dynamic pricing or demand response as a whole, most of those trials have used technology which obviously is old, because they take a long time to do these pilots, and because the technology has been developed very fast. So therefore, technology that is being used is generally inferior, far inferior to what we can see today. And in fact, most, for example, in-home displays that we've seen rolled out in trials are pretty horrible, to be fair. And but there are some pretty good ones available or coming onto the market now or soon. So we looked at some of these studies. So in Australia, in USA, and in Europe. One of the most successful ones was actually this study in Australia, in Perth. Very, very interesting studies. A lot of good stuff going on in Australia, actually. And one of the key things that we found from all of this is that in order to introduce these future services, including all the smart energy services that we're talking about introducing in the future, we have to approach things very differently from what we have done so far. And the first thing that we see here is that public communication, and I'm talking about public communication as in communication pushed forward and delivered not by the utilities, not by the technology companies, but actually on a public independent level, is extremely important as the first step. Before the utilities really get involved in spewing out what they think the customers are going to benefit, before the technology companies are really bragging about what the technology will do for customers, what is most important is that we first of all get the public communication across to the customer. Now this isn't just what we feel is true, this is what we've found to be true from those programs that actually work best. This is what we've actually aggregated from that. So what we see is that first of all you're coming through these sort of 7 basic stages. This is also being shown now in the water industry, even in Australia. But basically, for example, the first stage would be to build the public insight into potential benefits. And then gradually, as you go through the various stages, the utility companies play a larger and larger role in communicating precise benefits, precise activities, and the technology is more revealed to the customer. In other words, what you're trying to do, first of all, you're trying to get the customer to agree on the basic concepts from a neutral source, and then as time goes on, you introduce the solutions and the offerings to the customer in a very gradual, specific way. Now this is even very generalized as to how it should be, and in the final report, which you can all get hold of again as well for free, you'll actually see much more detail on that. But what I really mean by that, to sort of elaborate on that, this is a case of what happened in Perth, in Australia. Now, they had the Perth Solar City, which included a whole range of smart energy and smart demand initiatives. And the first stage was this stage on the left here, and that was really a very collective impact sort of approach, where they just put billboards, adverts in newspapers, I think the first one, and newspapers, billboards, and so on, where they I think seminars, where they basically tried to give a very clear view to the customer that everyone was working together here for a combined benefit. As they gradually went through, the next stage, for example, was to give customers examples of what they meant by that, to gradually bring in the idea of what examples of how customers